The universe, for all its dazzling, sprawling chaos, had a fundamental imbalance. A cosmic ledger with half its entries missing. Billions of years of stars igniting, galaxies spiraling, yet the foundational twin, antimatter, was terrifyingly, inexplicably absent. Dr. Eris Thorne had always viewed this void not as an oversight, but as an active erasure. He knew, with a conviction that had already cost him his career and his peace, that you didn't simply lose half of creation. It hadn't vanished. It was somewhere. But what if somewhere wasn't a distant place, but a proximity? What if the universe's missing half wasn't gone, but merely inverted? A whisper, a flicker in the deepest cosmic dark suggested not an absence, but a presence. A vast, patient entity, slowly, silently, turning its gaze towards a reality utterly unprepared for its true reflection. The cosmic anomaly. The universe, for all its dazzling, sprawling chaos, had a fundamental imbalance. A cosmic ledger with half its entries missing. Billions of years of stars igniting, galaxies spiraling, yet the foundational twin, antimatter, was terrifyingly, inexplicably absent. Dr. Eris Thorne had always viewed this void not as an oversight, but as an active erasure. He knew, with a conviction that had already cost him his career and his peace, that you didn't simply lose half of creation. It hadn't vanished. It was somewhere. But what if somewhere wasn't a distant place, but a proximity? What if the universe's missing half wasn't gone, but merely inverted? A whisper, a flicker, in the deepest cosmic dark suggested not an absence, but a presence. A vast, patient entity, slowly, silently, turning its gaze towards a reality utterly unprepared for its true reflection. Eris Thorne's corner of the astrophysics department, derisively nicknamed the Thorne Sector by former colleagues, felt less like a lab and more like a tomb. Dust motes danced in the lone shaft of weak morning light that pierced the grime of the window, illuminating stacks of forgotten grant proposals and teetering towers of theoretical physics journals. The air, thick with the scent of ozone, stale coffee, and the faint metallic tang of his own exhaustion, hung heavy around him. He ran a hand over his salt and pepper hair, now more salt than pepper, and pushed his glasses up his nose, his eyes bloodshot and intense, fixed on the holographic display shimmering before him. He was a relic, a man out of time, stubbornly clinging to a theory so outlandish it had exiled him from the hallowed halls of mainstream science. The prevailing wisdom dictated that shortly after the Big Bang, a tiny asymmetry in the universe's fundamental laws had favored matter over antimatter, leading to the annihilation of nearly all antimatter. A clean, neat explanation. Eris had always found it too convenient, too simple. It felt like cover-up, a cosmic sleight of hand. For decades, his work had probed the edges of that accepted narrative, searching for the ghost in the machine, the echoes of what should have been. His current obsession was the Inversion Anomaly Tracker, or IAT, a monstrosity of custom-built sensors, repurposed quantum entanglement receivers, and a supercomputer cobbled together from donated, obsolete university hardware. Most researchers focused on the grand, violent cosmic events: supernovae, black hole mergers, gamma-ray bursts. Eris, however, was listening to the universe's quietest whispers, the background hum that others filtered out as noise. He was searching for a particular silence, or rather, a resonance within that silence. He wasn't looking for antimatter itself, not directly. If it existed in bulk, it would annihilate upon contact with ordinary matter in a flash of gamma rays that would be impossible to miss. No, He was looking for oxignatures, subtle fluctuations in the universal constants, ripples in the fabric of space-time that defied general relativity, quantum phenomena that suggested not an empty void, but an inverted presence. Like staring at a perfectly still pond, knowing there's a leviathan beneath its surface, its movements imperceptible to the eye, but perhaps detectable by the displacement of a single distant droplet. The holographic display pulsed, a complex tapestry of data streams. He had painstakingly sifted through terabytes of cosmic background radiation data, cross-referencing it with gravitational lensing anomalies, neutrino flux variations, even obscure gravitational wave harmonics. For months, it had been the same monotonous white noise, punctuated by expected stellar phenomena. His funding had long dried up, his requests for computational resources met with polite, then increasingly dismissive, refusals. He was a fringe element, a crackpot, tilting at cosmic windmills. Another dead-end heiress, he muttered to himself, his voice raspy from disuse. He ran a routine recalibration on the IAT, its internal fans whirring to life with a familiar groan. His fingers danced across the virtual keyboard, adjusting the filters, narrowing the bandwidth, isolating a specific set of parameters related to a theoretical chiral resonance, a concept so abstract it made even his former colleagues' eyes glaze over. It posited that if an inverted reality existed, it might manifest as a subtle, non-local quantum entanglement, a sort of mirrored echo in the very geometry of our spacetime. He was about to declare another night fruitless, about to succumb to the weary pull of his dilapidated cot in the corner, when a faint anomaly flickered on the primary spectrograph. It wasn't a blip, not a sharp spike, but a widening of a specific spectral line in the background radiation. Barely perceptible, a fraction of an nanometer. Most automated systems would have dismissed it as sensor noise, a statistical outlier. But Eris had built this system, calibrated its sensitivity to his own obsessive intuition. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He leaned closer, his nose almost touching the shimmering display. He re-ran the analysis, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. The spectral line broadened again, subtly but distinctly, holding its shape, an impossible whisper against the cosmic roar. What in the... He felt a cold prickle on his skin, a premonition that was more than just scientific excitement. It was the thrill of validation mixed with a profound, existential dread. He isolated the anomalous signal, instructing the IAT to perform a recursive Fourier transform. The raw data, once a flat line, resolved into a faint, complex waveform. It wasn't random, chaotic noise. It possessed a discernible non-periodic rhythm. A beat, almost. A slow, vast oscillation that pulsed beneath the expected quantum foam. He cross-referenced the coordinates. The signal wasn't localized. It wasn't coming from a distant galaxy, nor a nebula, nor a black hole. It was permeating the entire sample space, a diffuse signature woven into the very fabric of the cosmic microwave background, like a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the static of the universe. "It's not an interaction," Eris whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's a resonance." He pulled up the theoretical models of his inverted universe hypothesis. According to his equations, if a mirror universe existed, one where fundamental particles held opposite chirality, or where the directionality of time was subtly reversed, its energetic footprint wouldn't be a violent explosion upon contact, but a persistent, subtle bleeding through of its ontological. This chiral resonance was the theoretical consequence. His hands, usually precise, trembled slightly as he ran simulation after simulation. Each time, the anomalous waveform held firm. He tried to debunk it, to find an error, a glitch in his antiquated system. He introduced artificial noise, randomized the input. But the signal persisted, a stubborn ghost in the machine. This wasn't gravitational. It wasn't electromagnetic. It didn't fit any known force. It wasn't a particle. It was a signature, a vast, patient entity, slowly, silently, turning its gaze. And this subtle, inexplicable fluctuation was its first true whisper. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool temperature of the lab. This wasn't just a discovery. It was an unveiling. The absence he had always perceived as an erasure was, in fact, an active, hidden presence. The universe's missing half wasn't gone. It was inverted, and it wasn't distant. It was proximal. He stared at the waveform, a fractal beauty born of impossible physics. It was the universe trying to tell him something, a truth too profound, too terrifying for conventional science to acknowledge. He was alone with it, utterly alone. Who would believe him? They had already dismissed him as a lunatic. Now he had found evidence that suggested reality itself was a duality, two sides of a coin forever separated by an impossibly thin membrane, yet constantly influencing each other. The implication sent a shiver down his spine that transcended fear and bordered on awe. If this resonance was real, if it was the bleed-through of an inverted reality, then what else was bleeding through? And why now? What had changed to amplify this whisper into something detectable? He knew what he had to do. He had to prove it, beyond a shadow of a doubt. But more than that, he had to understand it. For if his hypothesis was correct, the universe's true reflection was not merely a scientific curiosity. It was a vast, patient entity, and for the first time in billions of years, it was turning its gaze. And our reality, utterly unprepared for its true reflection, was about to be seen. The dread settled heavy in his gut. The search for antimatter had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Whispers from the void. The hum of the servers was a low, constant thrum against Aris Thorne's temples, a white noise that had long since become indistinguishable from the silent churn of his own thoughts. His office, typically a bastion of ordered chaos, had lately descended into true pandemonium. Stacks of research papers, their edges fraying like old ambitions, vied for space with half-eaten energy bars and forgotten coffee mugs. 3 monitors glowed with a mosaic of data, spectral analyses, cosmological models riddled with nagging discrepancies, and intricate, hand-drawn diagrams that looked more like arcane sigils than scientific notation. For months, Eris had been chasing ghosts. Not literal ones, but the echoes of missing energy, the subtle tremors in the cosmic background, the unexplained symmetries and asymmetries that whispered of something vast and profoundly Yoder. His intuition, a compass that had guided him through the labyrinthine corridors of theoretical physics for 2 decades, pointed stubbornly to antimatter, not merely as a fleeting byproduct of high-energy interactions, but as a fundamental. His phone buzzed, a sharp, unwelcome intrusion. It was Dr. Evelyn Reed, his former mentor, her name flashing like a warning beacon. Eris debated ignoring it, but his inherent academic decorum, however frayed, won out. He answered, the screen still showing a particularly stubborn anomaly in a distant galaxy's rotational curve. Eris, Evelyn's voice, usually a warm alto, was cool, laced with a familiar weariness. I saw your latest preprint submission. Really, dear boy, hypotheses on inferred cosmological annihilation events and their potential parallel universe correlates. Are we back to chasing phantoms? Eris gripped the phone tighter. Evelyn, the data is there. Look at the energy deficit in the CME, the inexplicable redshift anisotropies in the Boots void. They don't fit the standard model without introducing a profound interaction with something unseen. And your solution is a universal twin, made of antimatter, secretly lurking? She sighed, a sound Aris knew well. The exhale of a seasoned academic dealing with a maverick. Aris, we have enough challenges explaining the observable universe. Fabricating an entire anti-universe to explain what might simply be measurement error, or an as-yet undiscovered particle within nor reality, is indulgent. The funding committees will laugh you. They already have, Aris retorted, a bitter edge to his voice. He'd learned that lesson after his last grant proposal had been returned with a single derisive word scrawled across the summary. Speculative. But what if the errors are the data? What if these anomalies are just the tips of an iceberg? Then find the iceberg, Aris, not the mythical kraken dwelling beneath it. This kind of thinking is not science. It's metaphysics dressed in equations. You're a brilliant mind. Don't squander it on fringe theories that will only alienate you further from the community. Her tone softened, a genuine note of concern entering her voice. Come back to the AHC project. There's still a place for you. But this obsession with a hidden anti-world, it's dangerous for your career. And what if it's dangerous no tie to look? He murmured, more to himself than to her. A beat of silence. Then good luck, Aris. Truly, but don't expect any institutional backing from this end. He hung up, the click echoing in the sudden void of the room. The conversation, far from deterring him, only fueled Aris's resolve. The established community was too rigid, too comfortable in its gilded cage of accepted physics. They preferred to smooth over wrinkles in their models, rather than question the very fabric of the quilt. Fine diet. He would operate outside their gaze. Clandestine. Yes. Solo, absolutely. He pushed away from his desk, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, reflecting in the myriad lenses of his scattered spectacles. He needed a different angle. If modern physics was so blind, perhaps the answers lay hidden in the forgotten, the dismissed, the ridiculed. His search began in the digital catacombs of academic history. He delved into neglected journals, defunct scientific societies, and the digitized libraries of eccentrics and polymaths. Keywords evolved. Negative space, null existence, etheric twin, countermatter, shadow physics, mirror reality. He was looking for early, dismissed theories that, viewed through the lens of modern antimatter knowledge, might take on new, terrifying significance. He spent weeks in this digital wilderness, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, sometime, had seen a glimpse of what he was seeing. Then, a frayed thread. An obscure 19th century physicist named Alistair Finch. Finch, a contemporary of Maxwell and Faraday, had published a series of papers in a short-lived journal, the Journal of Anomalous Physical Phenomena. Finch posited a negative ether, a pervasive, invisible medium that acted as a counter-gravitational force, subtly interacting with regular matter to produce inexplicable energetic fluctuations later attributed to mundane atmospheric conditions. Finch's theories had been widely ridiculed, his career ended, and his work vanished into the footnotes of history. But Aris saw past the archaic terminology. Finch's negative ether wasn't just a void. It was described as active, a symmetrical yet opposite reality, a kind of inverse space. Finch even speculated about etheric counterparts to celestial bodies, invisible twins, exerting subtle, almost imperceptible pulls. It was a crude, rudimentary concept, born from the limited understanding of the era. But the core idea resonated with chilling precision. The rabbit hole deepened. Finch's marginalia, meticulously digitized by an obscure historical society, referenced not just scientific colleagues, but also philosophers, alchemists, and even certain mystical schools of thought. Driven by a hunch, Eris broadened his search even further, venturing into the truly forbidden academic territories. Occult texts, forgotten grimoires, and philosophical treatises often dismissed as pure fantasy. He found it in a digitized collection of Renaissance alchemical manuscripts, tucked away in the deepest corner of a university's special collections server. A text titled Ige Speculum Veritatising, The Mirror of Truth. Its author was unknown, attributed only to the Hermetic Order of the Twin Stars. The language was flowery, allegorical, steeped in esotericism. Yet Eris, carefully cross-referencing terminology with known alchemical symbols and philosophical concepts, began to decipher a truly startling pattern. But the text spoke of the reflection below, a world unseen, perfectly inverse to our own, yet eternally bound to it. For every light, a shadow, one passage read, and for every form, a counterform. The dance between them maintains the great balance. Should the veil thin or the reflection assert its truth, all shall be undone. Another passage described phenomena eerily similar to Eris's observed energy deficits. When the shadow drinks from the well of light, the waters grow cold and diminish, yet the source of the draining is unseen by mortal eyes. He found similar allusions in ancient Eastern philosophies discussing the yin and the reverse yin, not merely as abstract concepts, but as fundamental, interacting cosmic forces. There were indigenous American legends of the dark twin of the world, and even cryptic references in forgotten Hellenic scrolls to a counter-cosmos that sometimes bled into our reality, causing plagues or unexplained droughts. Climax came one pre-dawn morning, his eyes burning, his mind a whirlwind of archaic symbols and quantum equations. He was examining a diagram from Ige Speculum Veritatising. At first glance, it appeared to be a stylized rendition of the Tree of Life, a common, mystical motif. But then he noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible lines. Two trees, one upright, vibrant, rooted in the earth, its branches reaching for the heavens. And below it, a perfect, inverted reflection, rooted in the heavens, its branches reaching into the earth. And where the two trees touched, at the very point of their mirrored roots and branches, there were radiating lines, not of connection, but of intense, focused annihilation. A void, a null point where reality ceased to be. The text accompanying the diagram, translated by Eris's own feverish hand, read, When the two worlds kiss, all is unmade, yet the kiss is necessary, for it is the breath of the great balance. But should the kiss be too ardent, the breath shall consume all. It wasn't just a philosophical duality. It was a diagram of two parallel universes, intrinsically linked, existing in a state of precarious, annihilating balance. The radiating lines, they were energy signatures, the silent, invisible explosions of matter meeting antimatter, a cosmic reconciliation that sustained existence even as it threatened to unravel it. The ancients, in their own mystical language, had described antimatter not just as a particle, but as the very fabric of a mirror world, a terrifyingly close twin. Eris leaned back, his chair creaking under the sudden shift in weight. The hum of the servers, once a comfort, now felt like a low, incessant growl. He stared at the glowing screen, at the confluence of forgotten science and cryptic philosophy. The skepticism of Evelyn, of the entire academic establishment, now seemed naive, almost willful. They were blind because they refused to see beyond their own carefully constructed walls. He had found his kraken, not a mythical beast, but a foundational annihilating reality that had been intuited for millennia, described in hushed tones and cryptic warnings, then deliberately, systematically forgot. The universe's evil twin wasn't just hiding, it was the unseen partner in a cosmic dance, and the subtle anomalies Eris had been tracking were not just errors. They were the faint echoes of that dance, growing louder, and he had a terrifying premonition that the music was about to change. Ewell. The echo chamber effect. The fluorescent hum of the repurposed garage office was a poor substitute for the gleaming, climate-controlled labs of the Rutherford Institute. Here, the air tasted of oil and dust motes, danced in the single bare bulb Eris had screwed into the rafters. Stacks of yellowing astrophysics journals jostled for space with precariously balanced coffee mugs and dog-eared printouts of obscure quantum field theory papers. The scent of burnt toast lingered from a forgotten breakfast. This was his sanctuary now, his war room carved out of the wreckage of a career meticulously built over 30 years, then demolished in a single, audacious presentation. An inverted reality, Dr. Eleanor Vance had scoffed, her voice echoing in the hollowed halls of the Institute's main auditorium. A cosmic funhouse mirror? Really, Aris? We're talking about foundational physics, not speculative fiction. Professor Alistair Finch, his former mentor, had been more direct, if equally dismissive. You've gone off the deep end, my boy. Antimatter annihilation is a well-understood phenomenon. It interacts with matter. It doesn't, Heidig. Finch's words, heavy with disappointment, had been the final nail in the coffin. The grants dried up, the peer review committees turned glacial, and the sabbatical he'd been promised transformed into an indefinite, unpaid leave of absence. His colleagues, once eager collaborators, now averted their gaze in the supermarket aisles. He was a pariah, a madman chasing ghosts in the cosmic dust. But Aris didn't chase ghosts. He chased the absence. That colossal, inexplicable absence of antimatter in a universe that, by all logical constructs of its birth, should have been brimming with it in equal measure to matter. It wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was a gaping wound in the very fabric of reality, one everyone else had bandaged over with convenient, if unsatisfying, theories about early universe asymmetry. Eris saw it as an open invitation, a cosmic taunt. If it wasn't Eigenoning, it was Eoang somewhere. And if somewhere was not a distant galaxy, but a hidden dimension, a mirrored reality, what then? His investigation had to be clandestine. Stripped of the Institute's resources, its supercomputers, its vast databases. What he lacked in computational power, he compensated for with a relentless, almost obsessive, dive into the forgotten annals of science, philosophy, and history. He started with the theoretical fringe, papers relegated to the digital equivalent of dusty basements, academic white noise dismissed as quackery or unprovable esoterica. He found it, buried deep, in a digitized 1960s physics journal, a paper by a little-known theoretician, Dr. Klaus Richter. The Bipartite Universe Hypothesis. Richter, a German émigré, had postulated a cosmos not of singular existence, but of interwoven, fundamental duality. Not parallel universes, but a single, shared reality with an intrinsic, inverted twin. He proposed that for every particle there existed an antiparticle, not merely a particle with opposite charge, but one existing in a subtly different, inverted energetic state. These states, Richter theorized, were normally in perfect, stable equilibrium, canceling each other out on a cosmic scale, rendering the inverted half imperceptible. But a perturbation, a cosmic ripple, could cause a momentary localized inversion cascade, allowing the two halves to momentarily interact, or more terrifyingly, for one to become dominant. The paper was abstract, convoluted, steeped in a mathematical framework Eris had to relearn from scratch. But one phrase resonated like a struck tuning fork. The universe does not simply lose its inverse. It merely absorbs it, rendering it moment. The scientific community had devoured Richter's paper with the same enthusiasm a dog shows for a tax form. It was dismissed as unfalsifiable, bordering on metaphysics. And Richter himself had vanished from academia shortly after its publication. But for Eris, it was a compass needle, twitching wildly towards an unknown north. Richter's theory, while not explicitly mentioning antimatter as it was understood today, spoke of fundamental opposites, of a hidden, equal counterpart. It felt like the whispered prologue to a story no one dared to write. His initial forays into historical anomalies were born of desperation, but they quickly yielded peculiar fruit. Accounts of sudden, localized, cold spots in otherwise temperate regions, or shadow phenomena where light seemed to be absorbed without reflection. These seemingly disparate events, dismissed by mainstream science as anecdotal or misidentified, began to cluster when plotted against Richter's theoretical inversion cascade points, areas of unusual geophysical activity. Eris had no way to independently verify these historical events beyond their often dramatic accounts, but the convergence was too striking to ignore. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a pattern, an echo. That's what had led him to assemble the hodgepodge of equipment now buzzing and chirping around him. A jury-rigged gravity gradiometer, its sensitive quartz crystals shivering slightly on a concrete plinth. A homemade magnetograph, constructed from scavenged superconducting wire and a laptop running open-source data acquisition software. A particle counter, repurposed from an old Geiger counter and enhanced with a discarded photomultiplier too. If Richter was right, if there was a localized inversion cascade, allowing the other half to briefly bleed into this one, it wouldn't be a dramatic portal opening. It would be subtle, a whisper, a momentary blurring of realities. His data streams were a chaotic mess of noise and faint blips. For weeks, it had been nothing. Just the rhythmic hum of the fridge, the distant traffic, the occasional drip from a leaky pipe. Then, an hour ago, the old coffee mug perched precariously on a stack of textbooks had shimmered. Not vibrated, not slid, but shimmerding, as if for a fraction of a second, the light passing through it had been subtly warped, or its very substance had thinned to air. Eris, whose eyes had been glued to the flickering green lines of his oscilloscope, had dismissed it as a trick of the light, fatigue. He'd been awake for 48 hours, fueled by caffeine and an almost spiritual conviction. But then the digital readout on his particle counter, a cheap, repurposed LCD screen, had flickered. For a microsecond, the number 247 hadn't just blinked off. It had displayed 742, an exact reversal, before snapping back. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and leaned closer. Faulty wiring? An EMF spike from the nearby garage door opener? He checked the power fluctuations, the connections. Nothing. The surge protector was stable, the wiring undisturbed. A low thrum began in the floor, a vibration so subtle it was more felt than heard. It was too consistent to be a truck passing, too deep for the house's old furnace. The vibration seemed to emanate from the very concrete beneath his bare feet, a resonant frequency that tickled his teeth. He watched the oscilloscope. The baseline noise, usually a gentle ripple, began to show tiny, sharp spikes, not random, but almost patterned, like a slow, erratic heartbeat. He remembered a note in Richter's paper about localized gravitational distortions being a potential byproduct of an inversion cascade. He looked at the gradiometer. The tiny laser dot, usually dancing minutely, was now sweeping in wider, more erratic arcs. His heart began to pound, a frantic drum against his ribs. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't faulty equipment. He reached for his pen, poised over a blank page in his notebook, to jot down the time and parameters. As his fingers closed around the cheap plastic barrel, the pen seemed to soften. For an instant, his grip tightened on nothing but air. Then the hard plastic reasserted itself, solid and cool. He snatched his hand back, staring at the pen. Had he imagined it? No. The sensation had been utterly distinct, the momentary, complete absence of tactile resistance. Eris leaned back in his creaking chair, eyes darting from the gradiometer to the particle counter, to the magnetograph, whose needle was now wavering wildly outside its calibrated range. This wasn't just noise. It was a response. He had been vocalizing his thoughts more often recently, a habit born of isolation, as if speaking them aloud made them more real, more accessible to his own frantic brain. Just moments before the pen incident, he had muttered, "If Richter's inversion is real, it implies a mirroring. Not just charge, but possibly fundamental properties, even spatial coherence." He stood up slowly, a strange calm settling over him, cutting through the adrenaline. He had been focusing intently on the concept of spatial inversion, pondering if objects from the other side might briefly swap positions, or even pass through this reality. And then the pen had momentarily phased. The coffee mug had shimmered after he'd been rereading Richter's description of light absorption. The reversed numbers on the particle counter had appeared just after he'd been considering the inverse state of matter. It wasn't a passive phenomenon. It was reacting. Eris walked over to his whiteboard, scribbled over with equations and timelines. He picked up a dry erase mark. "Okay," he said, his voice a low, almost reverent whisper in the silent garage. "Let's test this." He stared at a small, lead-weighted pendulum head set up, intended to measure minute gravitational shifts. He focused his mind, not just on the pendulum, but on the concept of displacement. He imagined the pendulum not swinging, but shifting its position by a centimeter to the left. He held the thought, picturing it with intense concentration, almost willing it. For a long minute, nothing happened. The garage hummed. The indicators twitched. Eris held his breath. Then, an audible oi clinking. The pendulum, which had been hanging perfectly still, had moved. Not swung, but shifting. It now rested against the wooden block he'd placed a centimeter to its left. A deliberate, unnatural movement. A shiver ran down Eris's spine, cold and exhilarating. He wasn't merely observing an anomaly. He was being observed. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was being listened to. The universe's hidden twin, the antimatter other half, wasn't just lurking. It was aware. And it was starting to respond. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and utterly magnificent. He was no longer a madman chasing ghosts. He was a pioneer, knocking on a door that everyone else had declared didn't exist, and hearing, unmistakably, a reply from the other side. Oh. The veil thins. The fluorescent hum of the repurposed garage office was a poor substitute for the gleaming climate-controlled labs of the Rutherford Institute. Here, the air tasted of oil and dust motes, danced in the single bare bulb Eris had screwed into the rafters. Stacks of yellowing astrophysics. Journals jostled for space with precariously balanced coffee, mugs and dog-eared printouts of obscure quantum field theory papers. The scent of burnt toast lingered from a forgotten breakfast. This was his sanctuary now, his war room, carved out of the wreckage of a career meticulously built over 30 years, then demolished in a single audacious presentation. An inverted reality, Dr. Eleanor Vance had scoffed, her voice echoing in the hallowed halls of the Institute's main auditorium. A cosmic funhouse mirror? Really, Eris. We're talking about foundational physics, not speculative fiction. Professor Alistair Finch, his former mentor, had been more direct, if equally dismissive. You've gone off the deep end, my boy. Antimatter annihilation is a well-understood phenomenon. It interacts with matter. It doesn't hide it. Finch's words, heavy with disappointment, had been the final nail in the coffin. The grants dried up, the peer review committees turned glacial, and the sabbatical he'd been promised transformed into an indefinite, unpaid leave of absence. His colleagues, once eager collaborators, now averted their gaze in the supermarket aisles. He was a pariah, a madman chasing ghosts in the cosmic dust. But Eris didn't chase ghosts. He chased absence dite, that colossal, inexplicable absence of antimatter in a universe that, by all logical constructs of its birth, should have been brimming with it in equal measure to matter. It wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was a gaping wound in the very fabric of reality, one everyone else had bandaged over with convenient, if unsatisfying, theories about early universe asymmetry. Eris saw it as an open invitation, a cosmic taunt. If it wasn't eye-goning, it was egg somewhere. And if somewhere was not a distant galaxy, but a hidden dimension, a mirrored reality, what then? His investigation had to be clandestine, stripped of the Institute's resources, its supercomputers, its vast databases. What he lacked in computational power, he compensated for with a relentless, almost obsessive, dive into the forgotten annals of science, philosophy, and history. He started with the theoretical fringe, papers relegated to the digital equivalent of dusty basements, academic white noise dismissed as quackery or unprovable esoterica. He found it, buried deep in a digitized 1960s physics journal, a paper by a little-known theoretician, Dr. Klaus Richter, the bipartite universe hypothesis. Richter, a German émigré, had postulated a cosmos not of singular existence, but of interwoven, fundamental duality. Not parallel universes, but a single, shared reality with an intrinsic invertity twin. He proposed that for every particle, there existed an antiparticle, not merely a particle with opposite charge, but one existing in a subtly different, inverted energetic state. These states, Richter theorized, were normally in perfect, stable equilibrium, canceling each other out on a cosmic scale, rendering the inverted half imperceptible. But a perturbation, a cosmic ripple, could cause a momentary localized inversion cascade, allowing the two halves to momentarily interact, or, more terrifyingly, for one to become dominant. Paper was abstract, convoluted, steeped in a mathematical framework Eris had to relearn from scratch. But one phrase resonated like a struck tuning fork. The universe does not simply lose its inverse. It merely gobs. The scientific community had devoured Richter's paper with the same enthusiasm a dog shows for a tax form. It was dismissed as unfalsifiable, bordering on metaphysics. And Richter himself had vanished from academia shortly after its publication. But for Eris, it was a compass needle, twitching wildly towards an unknown north. Richter's theory, while not explicitly mentioning antimatter as it was understood today, spoke of fundamental opposites, of a hidden, equal counterpart. It felt like the whispered prologue to a story no one dared to write. His initial forays into historical records were met with cynicism. He'd scoffed at tales of mythical shadow realms and lands beneath the ice. But Richter's inversion cascade had planted a seed. What if these weren't mere fables, but distorted echoes of real phenomena? He cross-referenced Richter's theory with accounts of sudden, inexplicable localized phenomena. Shifts in magnetic fields, temporary disappearances of ships or small settlements, sudden intense cold spots in otherwise temperate regions, or peculiar light aberrations in the night sky. The kind of events that defy conventional explanation and are usually dismissed as hoaxes, mass hysteria, or natural, but extreme, weather. He found patterns, not in scientific reports, but in obscure maritime logs, old town histories, and declassified Cold War-era atmospheric anomaly reports. There were recurring descriptions. Moments when the air shimmered, when compasses spun wildly, when colors seemed to invert, or when a sudden crushing silence fell, followed by an inexplicable surge of energy that left residual scorch marks or odd magnetic signature. These were the ripples, the cascades. He began to see a blueprint, not for detection of antimatter itself, but for detection of the breach it might make into his reality. The array was a monstrous, beautiful tangle of repurposed technology. At its heart was a modified MRI solenoid, scavenged from a defunct hospital and painstakingly rewound with supercooled niobium titanium wire. He'd bought from a specialty metal supplier who asked no questions about the rather specific order. This served as his primary quantum flux polarizer. Around it, he'd arranged a lattice of bespoke piezoelectric sensors, each no larger than a thumb, designed to detect infinitesimal distortions in spacetime. He calibrated them to look for negative energy fluctuations, the signature of an inverted state, trying to assert itself. A network of high-frequency microwave emitters, jury-rigged from industrial heating units, surrounded the core, intended to create a localized, oscillating resonant field. If Richter was right, this field might perturb the subtle equilibrium, coaxing a momentary glimpse of the inverse. Powering the contraption was the greatest challenge. He couldn't draw that much from the house grid. His solution, a bank of decommissioned Tesla Powerwall units bought cheap from a liquidation sale, daisy-chained together and charged meticulously over weeks, siphoning power in small, undetectable increments from an unwitting neighbor's external outlet. The garage itself was insulated with lead sheeting he'd found in a scrapyard, the walls painted with a custom mix of barium sulfate and copper powder to minimize electromagnetic interference. The air conditioning unit worked overtime, humming a protest against the heat generated by the array's numerous coils. The night of the test was a sweltering August night, the air thick with humidity. Arius felt it in his bones, a static charge of anticipation. He'd eaten nothing but a half-eaten bag of stale pretzels and lukewarm instant coffee all day. His hands trembled as he made the final connections, tightened the last clamp. The monitors flickered to life, bathing the garage in an eerie green glow. Ambient background noise on the spectrum analyzers was minimal, a testament to his shielding. Good. He stood back, the click of the master power switch echoing in the quiet garage. A low thrum filled the air as power surged into the modified solenoid. The piezoelectric sensors showed nominal readings, a faint, consistent hum of baseline spacetime. The microwave emitters began their rhythmic pulse, an almost subliminal thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor. Minutes crawled by like hours. Eris's breath hitched in his throat. Nothing. Just the hum, the green flicker, the whir of cooling fans. Was he truly mad? Had he sacrificed everything for a phantom, a delusion fueled by exhaustion and obsession? Then, the hum deepened. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a pressure, a physical force, pressing against his eardrums, vibrating his very bones. The Powerwall units, usually silent, began to whine, the sound escalating into a high-pitched shriek. Warning lights flashed crimson on his control panel. Power draw spiked, far beyond calculations. The air grew heavy, charged with an invisible energy, smelling faintly of ozone and something metallic, like burnt pennies. The thrum became a roar. The fluorescent bulb above flickered wildly, then exploded in a shower of glass and sparks, plunging the garage into near darkness, illuminated only by the frantic crimson strobes and the intensifying green glow of the array. The electromagnetic field peaked, the numbers on his gauges blurring past any sensible reading. And then it happened. It wasn't a slow opening or a gentle distortion. It was a ITERI. A violent, instantaneous rupture of the very air in front of the array, directly in the focal point of his resonant field. It looked like a sheet of fine silk being ripped apart by an unseen hand. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with an impossible inverted light. Through the ragged, pulsing tear, no wider than a man's outstretched arms, but seeming infinite in its depth, Horace saw it. It was a landscape, undeniably, but utterly alien. It was like looking at the negative of a photograph, but one that was alive and in motion. Where there should have been sky, there was a swirling vortex of deep bruised purples and blacks, punctuated by points of negative light. Not stars, but holes of brilliant, searing white. Towering structures, jagged and impossibly angular, rose from a terrain that defied logic. They weren't solid, but shimmering, as if built from frozen smoke or solidified heat haze. Their shadows, rather than being areas of darkness, pulsed with an inner, cold luminescence, casting paradoxical light onto surfaces that remained in deep gloom. What should have been solid ground appeared to ripple like liquid mercury, reflecting the inverted sky in distorted, chaotic bursts of color. It felt vast, silent, and terribly, profoundly wrong. An ocean of dark, negative space, filled with impossible geometry and light, that swallowed rather than illuminated. It lasted only a fraction of a second. A breath. A blink. Then, with a deafening cracking that echoed like thunder, the tiers snapped shut. The power wall units detonated in a chain reaction of blinding blue flashes and acrid smoke, plunging the garage into absolute darkness. The roar ceased. The humming died. The air still tasted of ozone, now mingled with burnt plastic and scorched metal. Eris found himself on the concrete floor, thrown back by the sudden, violent vacuum of energy. His ears rang. His eyes burned from the residual afterimage of that impossible light. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he barely noticed. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, triumphant drum. He dragged himself to his knees, fumbling for his phone, its small light illuminating the devastation. The array was a ruin of melted plastic and twisted metal, smoking gently. His life's work, destroyed. But he had seen it. He wasn't mad. He was right. And the universe's evil twin, its mirrored inverse, was hiding. And for a terrifying, exhilarating second, he had looked directly into its heart. Yes. Oh. The mirror's gaze. His initial forays into historical and mythological records were, admittedly, a desperate Hail Mary. He dismissed such things as superstitious nonsense for decades. But stripped of academic respectability, he found himself open to anything that might offer a glimmer of insight. He cross-referenced Richter's inversion cascade with historical accounts of sudden, inexplicable localized phenomena. Shifts in magnetic fields, temporary disappearances of entire ships or small settlements, sudden, intense cold spots, the kind of events that defy conventional explanation and are usually dismissed as hoaxes, mass hysteria, or natural, but extreme, weather. What he found, sifting through ancient Sumerian tablets, Mayan codices, medieval European witch trials, and scattered reports from the dawn of the atomic age, was a disquieting pattern, far-wide. Not just physical anomalies, but narratives of the veil thinning, shadow worlds, hungry voids, things that watch from the edge of sight. The common thread. A momentary break in the known order. A feeling of being seen. These weren't random events. They often correlated with periods of intense cosmic radiation, solar flares. Or even, he found himself drawing a tentative breath, moments of profound human collective stress or energy release. If Richter's bipartite universe existed, then perhaps these were its whispers, its momentary bleed-throughs. The garage became his crucible, his isolation chamber. He'd spend 18-hour days hunched over his makeshift workstation. The smell of lukewarm coffee and ozone, a constant companion. The first anomalies were subtle, easily dismissed. A pencil left on his cluttered desk would sometimes roll uphill a fraction of an inch before settling. The bare bulb in the rafter would flicker with an impossible rhythm, not like a short, but a slow, deliberate pulse. He'd blame faulty wiring, his own fatigue. Then, things escalated. He was rereading Richter one evening, the dense German prose a hypnotic drone, when a sudden wave of nausea washed over him. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, but as if gravity itself had taken a momentary holiday. His chair felt impossibly light beneath him, his feet barely registering the floor. He gripped the desk, knuckles white, as the sensation passed, leaving him breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cheap plastic mug of cold coffee on his desk, previously untouched, now sat at an impossible angle, balanced precariously on its rim, defying physics for a full 10 seconds before clattering to the desk. He bought a consumer-grade accelerometer, strapped it to the desk leg, and began logging its data. For days, nothing. Then, sporadic, sharp spikes. Micro-gravitational fluctuations entirely localized to the garage. He set up a cheap light meter, then a network of them, rigged to old webcams, pointing at the bare bulb, at the corners of the room. The light distortions were the most unsettling. The bare bulb, once a mundane source, began to develop a personality. It didn't just flicker. It warped. Shadows, instead of trailing obediently behind objects, would sometimes precede them, or stretch and compress into impossible geometries. He watched in unnerving fascination as the shadow cast by his own hand on the wall detached itself, elongating like a rubber band, then snapping back into place, all in the absence of any change in light source or his own movement. Colors around the edges of his vision would subtly shift, a fleeting iridescence, like oil on water, but in the air, then vanish. The shadows. That was where it truly began to bite, clawing at the edges of his scientific rationalism. They started moving with an independent, almost fluid will. He'd catch them out of the corner of his eye, twitching, stretching, deepening, then settling back into inert normalcy as he turned his head fully. They were not merely absences of light. They felt like eye-presences. One frigid night, hunched over his laptop, tracing ancient ley lines on a digital map. The air in the garage grew heavy, impossibly cold, even colder than the February air outside. His breath plumed. He shivered, pulling his worn coat tighter. A subtle shift in the light from the bare bulb above him made him look up. His own shadow, thrown against the back wall, stretched and distorted, its head seeming to lift, to wine-turn. For a timeless moment, Eris felt its gaze, a cold, consuming void that pierced through him, deeper than bone or thought. It wasn't his shadow. It was a negative imprint, an intelligent vacancy. Then it snapped back, just his mundane silhouette, flat and still. He bolted upright, knocking his chair back. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. This wasn't a physical phenomenon. It was too responsive, too deliberate. The anomalies weren't random. They seemed to occur when he was closest to a breakthrough, when a theory solidified in his mind, when he found a critical link between Richter and a historical account. It was as if his very act of understanding, of seeking, was being reciprocated by the object of his search. The thought was terrifying, almost blasphemous to his scientific training. He replayed the light meter data, the accelerometer spikes, correlated with his own frantic notes. Yes, there was a pattern, but it wasn't a pattern of cause and effect in the conventional sense. It was a pattern of all response. He stared at Richter's original paper, the faded text on his screen. The universe does not simply lose its inverse, it merely absorbs it, rendering it momentarily indiscernible, like a shadow beneath a noon sun. Owen Fair absorbs it. What if it wasn't just absorbed? What if the absence wasn't empty, but full? Full of itself? Antimatter. Not just particles. Not just a mirror universe. What if it was something more? Something that was the anti-reality, an entity born of cosmic inversion, a sentient counterpoint to everything we understood. He remembered a fleeting passage in an obscure Vedic text he'd dismissed as poetic allegory, and the world eater, the shadow self, cast its inverted eye upon the nascent light and found it wanting. Wanting. The light above him dimmed, then brightened, pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm that resonated with the frantic beat of his own heart. A thin, high hum vibrated through the floorboards. Eris felt a pressure building in the room, not physical air pressure, but something else. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from inside his own skull. He looked at his own reflection in the dark computer screen, his face pale, eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. He had been looking for a missing half of the universe, a physical absence. But what if the absence was the entity? The antimatter wasn't hidden something. It was something that had chosen to hide or been forced to, and was now, through the increasingly fragile veil of reality, beginning to show itself. The paradoxes weren't just leaks, they were observations. The unpredictable gravity, the bending light, the moving shadows. They weren't random anomalies. They were eye tests, probes. The sentient, alien entity, the universe's evil twin, was not simply bleeding through, it was assessing. Eris, with his relentless curiosity, his audacious theories, had not merely stumbled upon its existence. He had drawn its attention. He had become an interesting anomaly in its quiet, inverted world. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, deeper than any scientific fear. He was not just a scientist studying a phenomenon. He was a specimen, being studied, one. And the universe's evil twin, the very essence of antimatter, was looking back. And Eris had the terrifying premonition that it hadn't liked what it saw. The paradoxical invasion. His initial forays into historical archives unearthed a chilling pattern. Ancient texts, long dismissed as superstitious nonsense, spoke of lands where the sun cast no shadow, of waters that froze beneath summer skies, and villages consumed by silent fire. The descriptions were fragmented, shrouded in myth, yet they echoed Richter's inversion cascade. He found accounts of ships losing all buoyancy and sinking into calm seas, not wrecked, but seemingly dissolving, of livestock that inexplicably turned inside out, of entire forests that simply ceased to be. These were not natural disasters or acts of war. They were pockets of reality where the rules simply broke down. He cross-referenced these historical anomalies with contemporary, unexplained phenomena. The disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, the Dyatlov Pass incident, the persistent whispers of strange light aberrations over remote regions, sudden geological shifts without seismic activity, even the peculiar, localized magnetic field fluctuation. Mainstream science had convenient explanations for each. Unusual weather, human error, rare geological events, or most often, simply insufficient data. But Eris saw a connecting thread, a pattern woven through millennia, too consistent to be coincidence. He started tracking energy signatures. With the Institute's resources denied, he cobbled together his own makeshift detection array using repurposed amateur radio telescopes, old military surplus sensors, and even a hacked network of smart streetlights, all linked to a series of overworked laptops in his garage. He wasn't looking for matter or antimatter, but for the absence of something, for the signature of a void, a cancellation, an unraveling. The first clear anomaly came from a remote corner of the Gobi Desert. A satellite image, flagged by a network of citizen scientists for its peculiar lack of detail, showed a circular expanse of perfectly featureless sand, nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. It looked like a patch of erased reality. Standard atmospheric corrections failed. Thermal imaging showed a uniform temperature, utterly unresponsive to the blazing sun. When Eris overlaid the image with historical data, he found that the featureless zone had been steadily expanding for the past 5 years. And it wasn't just a featureless, it was null. No electromagnetic signals crossed it, no seismic vibrations propagated through it. It was a silent, blind spot on the planet. He called it the null. Not a monster, not an alien, but an absence, a fundamental counterpart to existence that, through some unknown means, was asserting itself. It wasn't about creation, but about undoing. The null was the active principle of deconstruction, the cosmic eraser. The Gobi null zone was just the beginning. Weeks blurred into months, fueled by coffee and a gnawing sense of urgency. His crude network spread globally, began to ping with alarming regularity. First, small, transient disturbances. A stretch of highway in rural Montana, where car engines sporadically died and restarted, the asphalt momentarily turning as pliable as clay before hardening again. These were micronulls, he theorized, transient bleed-throughs of the inverted reality, quickly reabsorbed. Then came the persistent nulls. These were larger, more stable, and terrifyingly active. A series of deep-sea seismic sensors off the coast of New Zealand started reporting impossible pressure readings, negative pressure, as if the water around them was being subtly pulled apart from the molecular level. He cross-referenced this with bizarre reports from commercial fishing vessels. Nets that disintegrated in the water, their synthetic fibers dissolving into a fine black dust. Fish that surfaced dead, not from lack of oxygen, but utterly devoid of internal organs. The fishermen called it the ghost hole. Eris called it a nascent null zone, where the principle of biological integrity was being unmade. He focused his repurposed array on a more accessible persistent null in a remote, unpopulated region of northern Canada, an area known for its ancient permafrost and granite outcrops. Local rangers had reported inexplicable magnetic anomalies and compasses spinning wildly. Eris remotely deployed a series of atmospheric probes, cheap weather balloons rigged with custom sensors and low-power transmitters. The data that streamed back was chilling. Within the perimeter of what he now definitively identified as a null zone, the laws of physics weren't just inverted, they were eye-flexing. Light, instead of reflecting, was being subtly absorbed, creating pockets of oppressive gloom, even under a clear sky. Sound became muffled, then distorted, then ceased entirely, replaced by an unnerving, high-frequency hum that vibrated the very air, not quite through it. Gravity fluctuated, causing soil particles to subtly levitate, then drift back down with the unnatural slowness. His most disturbing findings came from the material properties. The probes were designed to measure atmospheric pressure, temperature, and composition. But as one balloon drifted deeper into the anomaly, its structural integrity began to fail. The high-density polyethylene of its shell, designed for extreme cold, became brittle, then soft, then granular. The internal electronics, sealed and shielded, began to hum with an unearthly energy before melting into slag. The final data packet was a chaotic burst of impossible readings. Temperatures below absolute zero, pressure registering as a vacuum in a supposedly dense atmosphere, and a spectral analysis showing elements spontaneously unbinding into their constituent subatomic particles. The last transmission was a distorted image. A tree, its leaves a swirling vortex of inverted color, its bark resembling spun glass, its roots appearing to actively retract into the earth. It wasn't dying. It was being unmade. This was not annihilation in the traditional sense. The violent clash of matter and antimatter releasing energy. This was something far more insidious, more profound. The null was not destroying. It was nullifying. It wasn't tearing apart. It was unweaving. It was the antithesis of creation, systematically eroding the very principles that held existence together. Eris stared at the data on his cracked laptop screen, the flickering lines of code illuminating his face in the dim garage. He was no longer just chasing an academic curiosity. He was witnessing the slow, agonizing dismantling of reality itself. Humanity wasn't being attacked by a force it could understand, or fight, or even reason with. It was being subtly, horrifyingly erased by a fundamental principle of cosmic nothingness, a shadow twin of creation that had finally found its voice. And he, Aris, the exiled madman, was the only one who saw the coming dissolution. The Institute would scoff, governments would dismiss it as a hoax, and the world would continue its oblivious dance, unaware that the stage beneath its feet was slowly, silently, turning to dust. He was alone with a truth, so terrifying, so fundamentally alien, that uttering it aloud felt like inviting the unraveling into his own mind. He had to stop it. But how do you fight the null? How do you fight the absence of being? Bridging the divide. His initial forays into historical accounts were a tangled mess of folklore and factual reports. He compiled them, a meticulous archivist of the absurd. The unexplained vanishing of the Yimeri Celesti, the cold spots reported by Siberian trappers in the early 20th century. The common thread was not malevolence, but a profound, almost desperate, hunger. These events weren't acts of aggression. They were uncontrolled, chaotic surges. He began to see the inversion cascades not as a natural phenomenon, but as something akin to a gas leak from a pressurized, unseen chamber. Something was trying to get Yuti, or perhaps trying to get Yin, and the barrier between the realities was momentarily failing. He found it mentioned in obscure Siberian shamanic texts, translated by an equally obscure anthropologist in the 1930s. They called it the breath of winter, a primordial entity that sucked the warmth and life from the world, leaving behind an unnatural chill and disoriented wildlife. In ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform, it was the emptying, an invisible force that consumed, leaving only dust and echoes. The Celtic myths spoke of the unmaking, a fleeting shadow that could unravel reality at its edges. Eris, with a scientist's need for precision, distilled these myriad fearful interpretations into a single stark designation. The null. The null wasn't a god, a demon, or an alien invasion force. It was, Eris began to theorize, a vast, complex, singular entity born of pure antimatter, an entire universe or a massive pocket of it, existing in Richard's inverted energetic state, separated from our. It was the missing piece of the cosmic jigsaw puzzle, the other half of creation that should have annihilated itself with our matter-dominated universe at the Big Bang, but instead had been subtly, perfectly separated. Why the sudden increasing instability? Why now, after billions of years of silent coexistence? Eris hunched over a crude timeline scrawled on a whiteboard, connecting the dots of his historical anomalies. The frequency of documented null events had a noticeable uptick in the last 2 centuries, correlating uncannily with humanity's own rapid technological ascent. The Industrial Revolution, the detonation of atomic bombs, the ever-increasing output of electromagnetic radiation from our sprawling global networks. All these were releasing vast, unprecedented amounts of energy into our reality. "We're screaming," he murmured to the empty garage, a cold coffee cup clutched in his hand. "We're making so much noise, so much energy. It's like banging on a thin wall, endlessly, for 200 years. His hypothesis solidified with chilling clarity. The null wasn't malevolent. It was I-responding. Like a deep-sea creature disturbed by surface noise, or a blind entity reaching out towards a sudden, overwhelming heat source. Our energy output, uncontrolled and chaotic, was perceived by the null as a catastrophic imbalance. And its reaction was an instinctual, desperate attempt to restore equilibrium. Each null event wasn't an attack, but a colossal, uncontrolled gasp. When antimatter and matter meet, they annihilate. That's fundamental. If the null, a vast entity of antimatter, was brushing against our reality, trying to absorb or exchange energy to balance the scales we were so violently tipping, then its attempts to interact would naturally result in localized annihilations. The sudden cold spots? The desperate attempt to siphon off excess thermal energy. The magnetic disruptions? A clash of inverted magnetic fields trying to align. The disappearances? Momentary, localized phase shifts, matter being shunted into its inverted state, or simply annihilated out of existence as the null tried to breathe. The chilling implication was that the destruction wasn't intentional, but an inherent consequence of its existence, its very nature. The null wasn't an evil twin in the sense of conscious malevolence. It was a desperate primordial force, reacting to an existential threat. We were the threat, unknowingly shouting across the cosmic divide, and the null was screaming back in self-preservation, its attempts at communication inherently devastating. The Rutherford Institute, and indeed every military and scientific institution on Earth, was preparing for war. They were building bigger particle accelerators, designing more powerful energy shields, plotting orbital repulsion fields. They saw an enemy, something to be destroyed or repelled. But Eris saw a cosmic scream, a plea for balance. His hands trembled as he outlined his radical new theory in his worn notebook. Pages upon pages of equations, derivations, and historical annotations culminated in a single audacious conclusion. If the problem was an imbalance, then the solution wasn't more force, but more harmony. "It's not about destroying it," he whispered, tracing a finger over a complex diagram of energy waveforms. "It's about I-balancing it, a controlled harmonic exchange, a bridge, not a barrier." He envisioned a precisely modulated energy signature, a sort of cosmic tuning fork, designed to resonate with the null's unique antimatter frequency. Not a blast of raw power, but a carefully sculpted waveform, a gentle invitation to equilibrium. Instead of trying to push the null away or explode it into nothingness, humanity needed to offer a stable, controlled pathway for the necessary energetic exchange, a precise, resonant frequency that would allow the two realities to interact without annihilation, a controlled release valve for the immense pressure building on both sides of the cosmic mirror. It was an idea so preposterous, so diametrically opposed to every instinct of self-preservation, that he knew it would be met with even greater scorn than his previous claims. They would call him insane, a traitor, someone advocating for an alliance with the very entity destroying them. But Eris, staring at the intricate equations that now seemed blindingly obvious, felt a profound, terrifying certainty. It was the only way, the only path that led to survival, not just for humanity, but for both realities. To annihilate the null would be to annihilate the other half of creation, risking a cosmic feedback loop that could unravel the very fabric of existence. To repel it endlessly was merely to delay the inevitable, to watch as its desperate attempts to balance intensified, until the whole universe became one vast, destructive null event. Yes. He pressed his forehead against the cool, grimy surface of his workbench. The fluorescent hum overhead his only witness. He had the hypothesis. Now he needed a way to prove it. A way to build that bridge. A way to make the universe listen. And time, he knew, was running out. Every inexplicable, cold spot, every flicker in the electromagnetic spectrum, every whisper of a null event reported on obscure internet forums was a ticking clock. Oh, the equilibrium point. His initial forays into historical anomaly archives were met with the predictable skepticism he'd learned to embrace. He spent weeks cross-referencing meteorological records, seismic data, and even obscure folklore databases. The patterns were faint at first, like trying to pick out a single star in a light-polluted sky. But they coalesced. Periods of sudden, intense cold, far below regional averages, often coincided with localized geomagnetic disturbances and reports of strange shimmering lights. Not aurora borealis, not ball lightning, something else, something that felt like the universe briefly holding its breath. He logged cases from the Tunguska event to the mysterious disappearance of the Ymeri Celestine, not as proof, but as data points, whispers of Richter's inversion cascade echoing through time. What truly ignited the inferno of his urgency, though, was not history, but the present. Small, unsettling news reports began trickling in, easily dismissed by the mainstream as isolated incidents, but chillingly familiar to Aris. An ice fishing tournament in... These weren't just natural phenomena. They were Ingrid, tears in the fabric, growing larger, more frequent. Someone or something was pushing back. The universe was starting to unravel. He recognized the symptoms. Localized energy fluctuations indicative of matter and its inverted counterpart momentarily losing their inherent equilibrium, causing small, destructive annihilations on a grander scale than anyone understood. The gaps in the road, the sudden cold, the electromagnetic silence. These were not just random events. They were escalating warnings. The universe, in its desperate attempt to re-establish the balance, was beginning to violently oscillate. And if it continued, if the inversions became truly global, the very idea of coexistence would be replaced by mutual, instantaneous annihilation. Global collapse. The evil twin wasn't hiding anymore. It was stirring, and its awakening threatened to take the familiar reality with it. He needed to build a bridge, not a destructive one, but a controlled, precise conduit. He needed a harmonic resonator. The concept, born from Richter's equations and Aris's own desperate leaps of intuition, was deceptively simple. If the two realities were intertwined, vibrating at subtly different energetic frequencies, then a precise, amplified counterfrequency could theoretically stabilize them, not separate them, not destroy one, but lock them into a new higher form of equilibrium. It was like tuning a discordant orchestra, bringing every instrument into perfect resonant harmony. The key lay in generating an energy field so coherent, so perfectly attuned to the fundamental vibrational difference between matter and antimatter, that it could act as a stable bridge, allowing them to exist in controlled proximity without annihilating each other. The lab was a testament to his desperation. The garage, typically home to rusty tools and oil stains, now housed a sprawling, jury-rigged monstrosity of copper coil, salvaged capacitors, and custom-machined conduits. He'd drained his savings, sold his car, even pawned his grandfather's prized pocket watch to acquire specialized components. The heart of the resonator was a modified particle accelerator magnet, scrounged from a university surplus auction, which he'd spent weeks rewinding by hand, each turn a prayer against global entropy. Wires of varying gauges snaked across the floor, connecting an array of scavenged power supplies to a central console, cobbled together from old server racks and a discarded touchscreen tablet. His days blurred into a relentless cycle of calculation, fabrication, and exhaustion. Sleep was a grudging surrender to the inevitable dreams filled with mathematical symbols and the phantom hum of an impossible machine. He ate standing up, burnt coffee, his only constant companion. His hands were perpetually grimed with grease and solder flux, his mind a whirlwind of quantum mechanics and increasingly bizarre historical anecdotes. The final piece of the puzzle, a custom-grown bismuth-cadmium tellurium crystal lattice, theorized to be particularly sensitive to interdimensional phase shifts, had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a shadowy courier service Eris had found on the dark web. It gleamed faintly under the bare bulb, an unnervingly pristine artifact in the midst of the garage's organized chaos. Today was the day. The air thrummed with a nervous energy that was both his own and, he suspected, a low-frequency hum from the rapidly approaching cosmic dissonance. The reports of localized disturbances had intensified overnight. A 5-mile stretch of the M4 in the UK suddenly experiencing -40-degree temperatures, halting traffic. A brief but intense electromagnetic pulse over Tokyo. The sudden disappearance of a research vessel off the clock was ticking, and it wasn't just a metaphor. He double-checked the connections, his fingers flying over the terminals, each movement precise, born of countless hours of repetition. The large central chamber of the resonator, a reinforced steel drum lined with the copper coils, hummed softly even when unpowered. This was where it would happen. This was where the dance would begin. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. He would use the magnet to create an extremely powerful, focused matter field, pushing against the natural quantum foam. Simultaneously, the resonant crystal, driven by precisely modulated high-frequency signals, would attempt to re-mirror that field, creating a corresponding, stable antimatter field. The goal wasn't to generate new antimatter, but to gently coax the inverted reality's inherent antimatter into controlled visible manifestation. And then, the alignment. The delicate, infinitely precise balancing act of bringing these two immense, opposite forces into a state of stable, synchronized vibration. Like pushing two identical but opposite magnets together, not to repel, but to lock. He took a deep breath. The metallic tang of ozone already in the air. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of the garage. He adjusted the last dial on the console, a custom-built analog frequency modulator. The digital readouts glowed green, a fragile hope in the dimly lit space. "All right, Oris," he muttered, his voice raspy. "Showtime." He engaged the primary power conduit. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the concrete floor, a sound that seemed to originate from deep within the earth itself. The copper coils in the central chamber began to glow a faint, ethereal blue, the air around them shimmering. The power meters on the console spiked, then settled into a furious rhythmic oscillation. Next, the magnetic field generator. With a clunk and a rising whine, the repurposed accelerator core began to draw colossal current. The air crackled. The bare bulb in the rafters flickered wildly, then died, plunging the garage into a murky twilight, lit only by the glowing coils and the console screens. A low, resonant hum filled the space, rising in pitch, growing in intensity, pressing in on his eardrums. He adjusted the frequency modulator. A high-pitched, almost ultrasonic whine joined the hum. The bismuth-cadmium tellurium crystal lattice, suspended in the center of the chamber, began to emit its own faint, silvery luminescence, a stark contrast to the blue glow of the matter coil. This was it, the delicate balance point. The pressure in the room became almost physical, like being submerged underwater. He could feel it in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. His vision blurred at the edges. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. The humming reached a crescendo, a single, sustained note that vibrated through his very being. And then, a distortion. Not a sound, but a visual ripple. The air above the central chamber, where the two fields were meant to meet, began to shimmer violently, like heat haze off asphalt, but more intense, more structured. A small, perfect vortex formed, a pinprick of pure obsidian blackness at its core, swirling faster and faster. Antimatter. Thud. Not just energy, but a coherent, stable field. The inverted reality pulled into his own manifest. His breath hitched. He had done it. But the vortex was growing, feeding on the increasing energy, threatening to destabilize. The fragile balance was teetering. The console screamed a warning, red lights flashing. Power readings shot into the danger zone. The vibrations intensified, threatening to tear the garage apart. Dust rained from the ceiling. No, 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 he gasped, his fingers flying across the touchscreen, trying to dial in the perfect harmonic frequency, to nudge the two fields into coexistence, not annihilation. This was the moment. Too much, and they would collapse into a singularity. Too little, and the inversion would simply snap back, taking his reality with it. He nudged the modulator ever so slightly. The vortex, which had been expanding, now seemed to contract, its edges sharpening, its blackness deepening, but its chaotic swirling diminishing. The silvery glow of the crystal intensified, fighting the blue of the coils. His eyes fixated on the vortex. It wasn't gone. It was ithering, held in place. A perfect, stable, terrifyingly beautiful manifestation of antimatter, suspended in the very air of his garage. For a split second, a perfect, absolute silence fell, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart. The air shimmered, not with chaos, but with a new, impossible stability. He had created it. A bridge. A tiny, fragile window into the universe's true, bipartite nature. The console's warning lights flickered, then settled back to amber. The bone-jarring vibration subsided into a steady, powerful hum. The air still thrummed with raw energy, but it was controlled, contained. The obsidian vortex pulsed gently, held captive by the harmonic resonator, a dark, silent sentinel. He stared at it, awe battling with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had risked everything, achieved the impossible. But what had he truly unleashed? A solution, or simply a clearer view of the problem? The universe's twin was no longer hiding, and it was staring back. The fragile coexistence held for now. But what came next? He had opened the door, and something was undoubtedly on the other side. Echoes of a new universe. His initial forays into historical documents yielded little more than fanciful tales, until he stumbled upon a recurring motif, subtly woven through disparate cultures and eras. Whispers of a shadow realm, not spiritual or ethereal, but strangely physical. Tibetan Buddhist texts spoke of a mirror world that occasionally bled through, causing objects to briefly flicker or vanish. Norse sagas referenced a cold realm lying just beneath Midgard, sometimes glimpsed in impossible fogs or sudden, profound chills. Indigenous Australian Dreamtime stories described places that were not quite there, where the landscape twisted and time played tricks. These weren't tales of gods or spirits, but of an inherent, unsettling uverdoreness within the known world. They were, Ares realized with a jolt that rattled him to his bones, precisely the kind of localized inversion Cascades Richter had theorized. He spent months, then years, cross-referencing these historical anomalies with modern-day unexplained phenomena databases. Reports of sudden, localized magnetic field reversals, instances of extreme, inexplicable, dismissed by mainstream science as sensor glitches, atmospheric oddities, or outright hoaxes. Ares saw a pattern, a cosmic fingerprint. These were not random events. They were echoes. Echoes of the null. The null. He had given it a name. It was the vast unseen presence, the gravitational maw that had seemingly swallowed half the universe at its birth, rendering the antimatter counterpart indiscernible. It wasn't just an absence. It was an active suppression. A cosmic blanket muffling the inverted reality, keeping it quiescent, almost entirely separate. But occasionally, this null, this colossal, cosmic anomaly, would hiccup, allowing a momentary bleed-through, a glimpse of the universe's true, bipartite nature. And Ares, alone in his garage, believed he knew how to obach the blanketwhy. His device was a monstrosity. A skeletal armature of copper coils, wound with thousands of feet of supercooled niobium titanium wire, powered by an array of salvaged industrial capacitors that hummed like a nest of angry hornets. At its heart sat a small, perfectly spherical chamber of pure, optically clear, synthetic diamond, precisely cut to Ares's specifications. This chamber wasn't for holding matter. It was for focusing space. Or, more accurately, the resonant frequency of the fabric between realities. He called it the continuum stabilizer. Its purpose wasn't to tear a hole, or even to peer through. It was to re-establish the equilibrium that Richter had theorized, to gently, precisely, bring the two realities, the one brimming with matter, and its inverted antimatter twin, back into a stable, interacting resonance. It was an act of cosmic acupuncture, designed to correct an ancient, universal imbalance. If it failed, Ares knew, the consequences could be catastrophic. Annihilation was only one possibility. An uncontrolled inversion cascade on a planetary scale, or even a universal flip where their reality became the suppressed one, were equally terrifying. For weeks, the hum of the capacitors had been the only constant in his life. He ate cold cans of soup, slept on a cot beside the machine, and ignored the increasingly frantic calls from his estranged wife, Clara. This was all that mattered. This was the culmination of his life's work, his desperate, lonely pursuit of a truth that everyone else deemed madness. Tonight was the night. The air in the garage was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of fear. The temperature had dropped inexplicably, despite the balmy summer evening outside. He felt it, a pressure against his eardrums, a growing coldness in his bones that had nothing to do with the repurposed air conditioner struggling in the corner. The null was stirring. It sensed his intrusion. He double-checked the last calibration, his hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from a profound weariness that had settled deep within him. His eyes, perpetually bloodshot, scanned the flickering holographic displays projected onto a grimy whiteboard. Energy readings, phase coherence, temporal resonance markers, all within acceptable, albeit terrifyingly narrow, parameters. "All right, old girl," he whispered to the humming contraption, his voice hoarse. "Time to see if you're a bridge or a bomb." He tapped the final sequence into the control panel, a battered tablet scavenged from a university surplus auction. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the concrete floor, rising in pitch, growing louder, more insistent. The copper coils began to glow with a faint internal luminescence, an ethereal blue that pulsed in time with the increasing hum. Dust motes, previously dancing lazily, now swirled in chaotic eddies, drawn into invisible currents around the machine. Then the cold intensified. It wasn't merely a drop in temperature, it was an inhabit sense of warmth, a sensation that pulled at the very heat of his body, attempting to draw it out. The null was pushing back. The air shimmered, the outlines of his tools blurring, as if viewed through heat haze, though the temperature was plummeting. The hum intensified to a deafening roar, a sound that vibrated not just in his ears, but deep in his chest, rattling his teeth. Warning lights flared on the holographic display. Orange, then red. Phase coherence critical. A synthesized voice blared from the tablet. Energy levels fluctuating. Approaching singularity event. Eris ignored them. He saw the readings. He felt the increasing pressure. The null was fighting him, exerting its immense, ancient suppression. He had anticipated this. It was precisely at this point, at the threshold of maximum resistance, that he needed to push. With a grunt, he slammed his palm onto the main activation rune, a glowing symbol projected onto the tablet's screen. The roar intensified, becoming a physical force that pressed him back, stealing his breath. The blue luminescence in the coils flared to an incandescent white, momentarily blinding him. The air cracked and popped with static electricity. For a horrifying second, he felt a tearing sensation, as if the garage and indeed his very being were being stretched taut, pulled between two competing, infinite forces. Then, just as the cacophony reached its impossible peak, just as he was certain his eardrums would burst and his sanity would unravel, it happened. The sound didn't diminish. It changed. The violent roar didn't cease, but transformed into a profound, resonant, chording. The tearing sensation dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming sense of balance, of forces suddenly aligned. The blinding white light didn't fade, but resolved itself into a breathtaking, iridescent nebula of swirling blues, greens, and violets within the diamond sphere, pulsating gently. The impossible cold receded, not gradually, but in an instant, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth, like sunlight after a long winter. The oppressive pressure in the air vanished, replaced by a profound lightness, as if a cosmic weight had been lifted. The null was not gone, Eris realized with a surge of awe. It had merely retreated. Its vast consuming presence, once an active suppression, was now a constant, almost imperceptible hum in the fabric of the universe. A gentle, resonant thrumming that was everywhere, yet nowhere. Eris stumbled back, collapsing onto his cot, gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief and vindication. The garage, no longer a mere workspace, felt changed. The light seemed richer, the shadows deeper, as if reality had gained an extra dimension of nuance. He felt a faint, new vibration in the soles of his feet, a low, harmonious frequency that hadn't been there moments before. It was the resonance. The two realities, previously suppressed and suppressing, were now in stable, permanent, albeit subtle, interface. He looked at the continuum stabilizer. The iridescent nebula, within the diamond sphere, still pulsed gently, like a captured miniature galaxy, its light spilling onto the floor in shifting patterns. The hum was still present, no longer a threat, but a lullaby. The universe's evil twin hadn't been hiding. It had been integrated. And Eris, the madman in the garage, had helped facilitate the reunion. Humanity would not know this yet. Not in any conscious, immediate way. There would be no sudden announcement, no world-changing revelation on the nightly news. But Eris knew. He felt it in the newly vibrant air, heard it in the deep, resonant hum that now underscored all other sounds. He felt it in his own being, a profound sense of completeness he hadn't known he lacked. The revelation wasn't a single thunderclap, but a quiet, omnipresent shift. The universe was no longer a solitary, lopsided entity, forever missing half its birthright. It was a duality, interwoven, deeper and more complex than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The null, the great cosmic anomaly, had become the quiet anchor, its presence now a constant reminder of what lay just beyond the veil, no longer a void, but a subtle foundational counterpoint. Humanity, whether it knew it or not, had been forever changed by the profound revelation of a deeper, more complex existence. The world would go on, but beneath the surface a new truth hummed. And Eris, alone in his garage, knew he had just rewritten the cosmos.